terms of data breaches, sometimes it could be a bit of a taboo subject to say that I'm actually going to report that there's been a data breach.
Yeah. People think as a data protection officer, your biggest concern is going to be, oh God, we're going to have millions of data breaches and they're all going to be terrible data breaches. Equally as big concern for school SLTs and governors is if these things are happening and they're not then getting reported.
What would you say would be the biggest challenges in schools making that cultural change?
I think number one, limited resources. People, wearing so many hats in one given role at a school just makes it ever tougher. I think the second thing, which we also know is a challenge in the education sector, high staff turnover. There is a way, while that's not ideal, that you can try and twist that and work that to your advantage. The other key thing I think is awareness and training. Schools also have got to bear in mind that if we do have a higher risk data breach, that we advise needs to be reported through to the ICO. The issue that you then have is that on the form, they will actually ask, when did the member of staff involved last receive their training? Now, what you really don't want to be doing is saying, 5 years ago, ouch.
Welcome to the Cantium podcast in partnership with Public Sector Focus. My name is Asare, and I'll be your host for this podcast today. And I'm the Education Account Director at Cantium. Today with me will be Adam Halsey, who is the Invicta Law Data Protection Officer for our Cantium Schools. And we're here to talk about data protection culture. So Adam, what would you say the current state of data protection is in UK schools currently?
Well, I would say, Will, it's a challenge. I think that's the first thing to say. But the schools are actually handling it really well on the whole from what I see. And it's a challenge because it's not your typical sort of customer business relationship. Not only have you got a situation where you've got the data subject, the pupil or the parent, you've got those multiple stakeholders in schools. So they're having to deal with parents and pupils. And sometimes those things can all come into conflict with each other as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it's that sort of that sheer number of stakeholders that as a school you're dealing with on the data protection front, that's what's giving you more of a challenge, I think, than sort of certain other types of organisation business throughout the country.
Yeah. So we know school leaders tend to have so many different issues in terms of data compliance, and some schools take it as a tick box exercise, or some organisations take it as a tick box exercise. What ways would you suggest could make it better within an organisation to make sure that data compliance becomes more embedded or more part of the culture?
I think that's it, as you say. I mean, schools, you can just see by going on their websites, the actual compliance in front of you in writing, it looks really good. And it is really good in a lot of cases. You've got good policies in place, good communication going out there, explaining to people how they can exercise their rights, how the school is actually handling their data. That's a really good start. But it's that sort of hyphenated tick box phrase that you use. That's what we've got to get away from and move towards actually living and breathing it every day. And that's what the best schools are doing. It's all about the culture, living and breathing it every day, and not just simply having the policies in place in writing.
As we're talking about schools, is there kind of any differences between our LA schools, our single mats, and then of course our multi-academy trusts as well? Would you say there's difference in terms of data compliance for them?
Some subtleties. I think most of the overall compliance obligations and challenges are the same, as you'd expect. And that doesn't change as you leave the education sector either. That's going to be the same across all types of organisation and business who are subject to the Data Protection Act and to the UK GDPR. I think where you do have your subtle differences is, you mentioned academies and maintained schools. We've got some differences there. So as a maintained school, you've also got to deal with requests made under the pupil information regulations as well. You can sometimes be in a situation as a maintained school where you're not really sure how you should be responding. Should you be treating it as a subject access request? That's your UK GDPR. Or should you be responding under the pupil information regulations? Now, that's where your DPO, they'll help with that one, and they'll sort of help schools with how best to communicate back to the parents or to the requesters on that. For academies, they aren't subject, or they don't normally have to respond to those pupil information regs. So it's always going to be a subject access request if someone asks for a copy of their data or of their kids' data. But they then have a different type of challenge. They then have to know, right, well, okay, what do I actually do if somebody writes into me and says, I'm requesting my child's data under the pupil information regs. Can I just sort of turn around and say, no, goodbye, and never talk to them again? shouldn't really do that. Best thing to do, and definitely, again, what the best schools are doing is they're having that openness, their transparency, saying, look, we don't actually deal with or we're not subject to these kind of regulations, but we're going to treat your request as a subject access. And the challenge that the academy then might have is that will, particularly in a secondary school, very often require the young person's consent before they can proceed, which isn't an issue that the maintained schools are going to have if someone has put in a request for under the pupil information regs. So sorry, that all got a bit technical, appreciate that, but it just goes to show you that there are some subtle differences in how schools do need to respond depending on what your governance on your structure is.
I'll definitely say from what we've seen is there's not a lot of knowledge known amongst that. A lot of it's been fallen upon maybe the network manager in order to gather that information or do that and their team, but without actually having the full knowledge to know what they should be giving out or what they should be doing, it also tends to be rather challenging.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's where your DPO comes in, whether it's an internal DPO who's going to be that individual within the school, employed by the school with that expert knowledge of the legislation, or whether it's going to be an external DPO. That's something that I'm more used to filling that gap as the external DPO for schools' customers. And even then, schools, and this is where the culture challenge comes in, are still going to need to have that, or those people internally inside the school who are sort of championing data protection, because even though we can be there with the support, the advice, you can't do everything from when you're not in the building effectively. I think one other important challenge on the academy front to note, Will, is for particularly our larger multi-academy trusts. They're going to have a situation whereby, you might have 25, 30 academies, all of whom might maintain some of their separate identity and their links with the communities before they actually came in to form part of that wider trust. But one area where I'm sort of encouraging our academies and schools, they've really got to show that consistency is in your data protection compliance and your policies. What obviously a large MAT or any MAT is going to want to avoid is a situation where you've got somebody in school A saying, I spoke to Sandra, who just emailed school B in your trust, and she got a completely different response. That's another challenge that you're going to have when you're a larger sort of trust of academies.
So, Adam, is there any ways that technology could help out with this? Is there any things that you've seen or from all the analysis that you've gotten to say there's some policies or there's some practices or some tech that can help out from your single LA schools, your smaller MATs, or your larger multi-academy trust, which sometimes spans different boroughs and different postcodes?
Well, I think in the first instance, thinking about tech and systems, having, especially these days, good online platforms and systems in place, that's really going to help both with, one, your general data protection compliance, and two, helping to make sure you've got that consistency if, again, you are a larger group of schools. So to have a platform where you can log all your data breaches that can be seen by the data protection officer and the DPO can advise on them, you can log all your pupil information requests, your subject access requests. Now, if you're a DPO who's advising on that platform and you're advising for all the schools within, say, a large trust of academies, that's where then having that all in one place online, that can really, really help with that consistency element, because then everybody can see in one place what the expectations are, what the rules are. And it's not just something that's going to be sort of, tucked away for one school, but the other school's not going to know what's going on. So I think that's a very basic first example, but that's just definitely one good thing to have in place to help with that consistency.
Something I want to touch on what you said as well, in terms of data breaches, sometimes it could be a bit of a taboo subject to say that I'm actually going to report that there's been a data breach because it kind of be seen bad. What could you say would potentially help or encourage or, help staff to be able to say, look, bring it up, talk about it and assist us in order to hopefully move forward?
That's a really good question, Will, because actually people think as a data protection officer, your biggest concern is going to be, oh God, we're going to have millions of data breaches and they're all going to be terrible data breaches. Obviously that is up there. It's almost one of the biggest concerns. A bigger concern actually, and it should be equally as big concern for school SLTs and governors, is if these things are happening and they're not then getting reported through to the SLT, through to the data protection lead, and through to somebody like myself as an external DPO. So how do you get around that? Well, again, that's where the culture piece, I guess, comes back in. You have to, and this is where I think it's important to say, where we talk about data protection culture, that's just not something that, again, sits locked and ring-fenced as a culture in its own right. You see where I'm going with this. The data protection culture has got to link in and will link in to the wider culture at the school, the wider organisational culture. So a lot of the schools I've come across that we work with, they seem to have pretty good cultures in place on this front. And we do see that where there are incidents, they do get reported and we deal with them. But what you obviously would want to avoid having in place, and what wouldn't help with that, is if you thought that a school had a culture of, right, okay, if I say something's gone wrong, I'm going to be on a final written warning, or I'm going to be out the door. Now, if you have a situation like that, you can see that these things are going to happen, and they may, best will in the world, will just be swept under the carpet. Because obviously people don't want to lose their job. They think they've worked hard for years and years, and they think, I've got one mistake and they're going to get rid of me. So I think the key thing, particularly on the data breaches front, is to be clear again. It sounds boring to say, but be clear with the expectations on what happens if there is a breach. So let's not have a different route that we take when Sandra commits a breach to when Adam commits a breach. Let's make sure we're always following the same process. It might be that we deal with the situation, we try and contain the breach to start with, but then maybe once the dust has settled, we sit down with the people involved in the breach, not in an accusing way, not in a finger-pointing way, but just to go through, right, what actually was the root cause here, and what can we then put in place collectively to reduce the chance of that happening again. And that is what the ICO as regulator really want to see from schools and all other organisations, and that's going to kind of be then a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then people will know that's the process, and they'll be more confident in reporting these things, and you're not left with that kind of thing that you really fear as a DPO, which is that you fear you're trying to support an organisation where there's a bit of a more toxic culture, where these things are going to be swept under. Happy to say that's not something that I come across. Our schools do really well in terms of communicating what's expected from all members of staff on the data protection front. Always ways that we can look to improve that, and crucially, not to get complacent about it. Last thing you want to do is pat yourself on the back too much, saying we're doing really well here, and then actually things drop after a period of time, and maybe that culture falls away and people think, we don't really need to report this stuff anymore because it's dealt with. That's where we know that we're in trouble if that complacency creeps in.
I think some of the things that you're touching on as well is kind of nice regarding culture, but we also, hopefully linking to it, we're speaking to a lot of our academy trusts, we're speaking to a lot of our schools, and schools are seeing issues in terms of staff retention, obviously budget cuts. How could a DPO service assist them or help them with that, in terms of, because some schools will just say, we'll allocate somebody within house to do that. There is a plethora of people on the market as well who are just, in essentially a race to the bottom. In order to get the cheapest DPO service. What ways would you say that the service that you guys provide assist our schools?
So I think you're really adding value when you can do not just what's in your, the core aspects of your SLA or your contract. You want to sort of make sure that you show your schools as customers that you're living and breathing the data protection situation with them. And one thing that you can do on that front is to not force people into sessions or training sessions at a particular time that best will in the world just not everyone's going to be able to make, or maybe even a very small percentage of school staff can actually make. Because as you quite rightly say, it's resources, it's constraints within schools, people, teachers, office managers, business managers, they're often wearing multiple hats, not just kind of doing an HR job or an administrative job, front office job. So many hats. So how do you fit the time in for data protection? Well, that's where your external DPO will come in and offer that support in the form of maybe some on-demand updates, some on-demand training that can be sent round to key staff at schools, or those schools that really need that training. And then that's something that you've produced, you've recorded it, and it's there for them. It's there for them when they need it. And they might not get a chance to watch that until 2 or 3 weeks' time, when they finally get a bit of space in their diary at lunchtime or something. But it's there for them when they need it. That isn't to say that you can just keep putting that off forever. And that's kind of where I think, on the flip side, it's also good to be able to get a lot of people maybe on a call all at once, so you can kind of do it and deal with it and have the training there and then. That's something that we can also do, and we're sort of planning to do as well in some cases. So I think there are arguments for both, but that's where you're really adding your value. As I say, you're not just kind of, I spoke about tick boxing a minute ago.
Yeah.
It's fair, it's only fair if we as the DPO providing the service aren't also tick boxing. We need to be doing more than that and making schools understand that we get them, we get the challenges that they have, and we live and breathe it with you as well.
You guys seem pretty malleable in order to hopefully understand our whole customer base. But with that, is there many similarities between, would you say, the education market and corporate market as well as local authority?
Yeah, I think the thing with the easy answer would be to say, oh, look, it's different in the education sector to how it is elsewhere in the country. And we could find some sort of pull out some excuse or reason or example for that. I think the reality is there's more similarities than there are differences. School, a law firm, a bank, hospital, NHS trust, pharmacy, wherever it might be, they're going to have those similar challenges. I think what we said at the start was that if you're somebody like a school or another type of institution in the education sector, I think where you do have some additional challenges are where you've got the whole parent-carer element as well. It's not just that service provider data subject relationship. You've actually, you're providing a public service. You've got your people you're providing the public service for their education. You've then got their parents, their carers. You've got everybody who wants the best interests for the child, the parent, the carer, and the school. Child also wants to, no doubt what's in their best interest too. So, but sometimes those things are tricky to all match up. And I think where you increase the number of stakeholders, that's where the challenges are greater. So that's where I do think you've got bigger challenges maybe in schools than you do in other types of setting. But broadly, challenges on how do we allocate the time to deal with this mammoth subject access request we received? How do we make sure that we've got good processes in place to deal with our data breaches? How do we make sure all our data subjects are aware of how we're processing their data? Those challenges are all pretty universal.
So Adam, what would you say would be the biggest challenges in schools making that cultural change?
I think number one, limited resources. We all know we're not going through a period at the moment where schools are having a great time, an easy time, in terms of doing what the people there really want to do, what they really care about doing. Budget constraints, the overall financial situation, it is tough. And that in turn is going to lead to that resource, those limitations on resources. As I said a while ago, people, wearing so many hats in one given role at a school just makes it ever tougher. I think the second thing, which we also know is a challenge in the education sector, among other sectors, you think of health, you think of social care, high staff turnover.
Yeah.
So I think, which we can come to in a minute, there is a way, while that's not ideal, that you can try and twist that and work that to your advantage. It also generally, you would say, doesn't help the situation. The other key thing, I think, is awareness and training, and that really is where your DPO, whether they be internal or external like us, are going to come in. Trying to create that time, that space to actually get that learning in there, make sure people are aware of their obligations. Because as we said at the start, it's really good. We've got all the written compliance in front of us in place. We can see we've got good policies, see we've got good procedures, but make sure people are living and breathing it every day. And that's about awareness and training put together that are going to help with that.
And with your experience working with hundreds of schools, what tips or tricks or bits of nuggets do you think you can share with us that will help that cultural shift and that cultural change in our customer base?
Yeah, so firstly, alluded to a minute ago, just trying, and it can really be trying sometimes, but trying to make that time and space for it. And that might mean planning many months in advance to maybe use an inset day or something like that to actually get everybody together. Maybe even, pretty much in one room, or maybe split into a few rooms if you can, so that there's that sort of sense of, I don't want to make it sound too exciting, but you can build a sense of camaraderie from these things as well, even with something like data protection, which is perceived, I think, wrongly, but is perceived as a dull topic. Very important, but some perceive it as dull, which I don't agree with. So that's number one. I think number two, we mentioned the point around training and refresher training. So make sure that that's taking place regularly. All staff at our schools should be doing some form of data protection training or refresher training at least every 2 years.
Okay.
And that's really, really important, because it's not only is that keeping them abreast of everything they need to be abreast of, and it's sort of reducing the chance of errors happening in the first place. Schools also have got to bear in mind that if we do have a higher risk data breach, that we advise needs to be reported through to the ICO. The issue that you then have is that on the form, they will actually ask, when did the member of staff involved last receive their training? Now, what you really don't want to be doing is saying 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Ouch. You've immediately then got a situation where you have a regulator that isn't necessarily confident that they're dealing with a school or an organisation that have that awareness of their obligations, because it's not only did they make a mistake, didn't they make a mistake. Schools have got to remember, from the regulator's perspective, it's, are they aware? What did they actually have in place, and are they aware of their obligations? That's why culture is just as important as what's written down on paper with data protection. I think the most challenging thing to do is to then make it part of the norm. We can talk through all these things we can do to improve. You then got to make it part of the norm. Now, I mentioned a while ago turnover. It's far from ideal, and I know that that's not something that schools or most organisations want. If you are going through a period where you're having that high turnover, and you also are trying to initiate some form of culture change at the same time, use that turnover to your advantage. You've got a few staff coming through the door, quite a lot of staff, more than normal, coming through the door. Get in front of them straight away. Get in front of them on day one, at least week one, but preferably day one.
Yeah.
So you can make clear what the expectations are on data protection. Now, head teacher SLT is going to be thinking, sort of, come on, Adam, come on, they've just started, they've started in a new deputy head's role or office manager role. They've not got time to be spending half an hour, whatever, talking about data protection. They've got to get abreast of this management information system. They've got to get abreast of all the school policies, how general day-to-day life at the school works. But we've got to find the time for that. And actually, if you can get in front of people on day one, they will know straight away, new members of staff, what's important for that school and for that school senior leadership team. And they'll be thinking, right, okay, if there's one thing alongside all the obvious things we have to get right, there's one thing I better make sure I'm getting right, it is data protection. I better make sure I'm being ever so diligent on where I'm sending my emails, double, triple checking email recipients, making sure I've not attached, Kira's early health plan to an email to Bethany's parents, which can happen. I better make sure I'm on that. And that's something that really, I think, gets through to people. I've seen this from experience. If you can get through quite early on. And the other thing to try and make it part of the norm, Will, is to not just make it a top-down thing, not make data protection just something where you've got Adam or you've got a school head teacher or an SLT sort of wagging the finger almost and dictating down towards people. If it's seen like that, immediately you risk ending up, whether you're a school or any other type of organisation, you risk ending up with that us and them thing. Does that make sense? So what you really want to do to avoid that is to try and make people, don't want to make it sound too hipster, but make people feel part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The way that you do that is by, if you do have an error that's been made, hopefully it's not anything that's been too too destructive, too world-ending. But try and engage that member of staff in the process for, okay, what actually was the root cause of this, and how can we prevent a repeat? And I think the best engagement, the best staff engagement that you can get as a school on data protection is where those people who have been involved in a mistake, they're leading or at least co-leading or being involved in that solution. Otherwise, then it's something that they're owning themselves and they feel part of. And it's not just a head teacher or a DPO or a senior leadership team imposing something top down on them. So I think that's another really useful trick to really try and implement that culture that we all want.
I'm thinking actually as well, if you involve them in that, they're more likely to report data breaches rather than have that fear of, I'm going to keep this, hopefully nobody finds out. And then potentially leaving it later on to escalate. That's
exactly right. It all sort of fits in with each other. So I think that is it's tricky. It's very easy sat here with you saying, we can talk for ages about organizational culture and data protection culture and how that fits in within an overall organization's culture. But people will quite rightly be watching thinking, well, okay, how do I actually do it? How do I actually do it within my limited time that I've got, my limited constraints? And sometimes it's easier than you think. And it may take time, but often, again, I've seen this from experience, these things can then sort of turn out good. And you don't really see the point in time where it did suddenly turn out good, but suddenly you go in one day to school and you realise, hang on, I've got a situation where I've got people that are just talking this language of data protection. They're not kind of doing it trying to sound clever, or it's not new. They're talking about, I better just check with Julie, that I have got the right person here. Or I remember this data breach we had a year or so ago where someone should have double or triple checked. It becomes part of the day to day, and I think it's at that point that it feels really rewarding if you're a school, because you can realise that without actually going around the world and back, you have actually made a real change just by making those few little changes in maybe how we do things.
And recently in the news, we've had things in terms of NHS trusts, we've had data breaches, systems going down. How do you see the landscape changing in terms of data protection, or do you have any predictions, or do you think it'll be very much exactly the same, business as usual?
Well, I think there's the obvious, which is to say that I think that probably anyone listening to this already or watching this already knows that cyber attacks, phishing, the list could go on, all the rest of it. People are finding more devious isn't quite the right word, but it is sort of, they're finding elusive ways, exactly, and it seems more and more legitimate. So where you think you've got it nailed, I know exactly what to look out for, they're always looking more and more lifelike and more realistic. So, Tony Blair, what did he say, sort of 28 or whatever years ago, education. The 3-word repetition I can think of at the moment to try and counter that is just diligence. It's just, don't be complacent. Any email you get in, if you're a school or indeed any other type of organisation or business, first of all, if you're not necessarily expecting something from that person or that organisation, then one antennae should already be standing up at that point. That's where you then got to make sure that you're engaging with the right people within your school. So your IT, your central IT services, if you're a large multi-academy trust, or your local IT, if you're a school sort of standing in its own right. But then also make sure, and feel free to contact your DPO. Your DPO might not have all the technological answers in terms of, is this legitimate, is this not legitimate? They'll have some advice maybe on steps that you can try and take with your IT to try and work out if you do have an issue or not. But far, far better, I think the lesson is to be to let things wait and just check. Rather than go ahead, click on something, respond to something that could then invite in sort of illicit agents, if you like. And I think the main thing there is one key thing that feeds into that is training. So you can have data protection training, but cyber awareness training, that's also something that anybody in a DPO position is going to be begging their schools or whoever they support to make sure that they are refreshing and they're putting out there. Because the last thing you want is to fall victim to any kind of that attack. But what you want even to avoid even more than that is a situation where you couldn't show that you had anything in place to try and prevent it.
It's interesting because I think we've seen, building on what you said, so many different ways attacks are happening, especially in our education market. We've got partners out there who are highlighting the dangers and the way people are focusing on the education market for accessing data, to get the data of our pupils, and then the ways they can use them and sell them and move them on.
That's frightening, isn't it?
And it's also interesting, as you alluded to as well, the varying different ways, because sometimes I think a lot of our customer base are focused on, the senior leadership team having the training, but sometimes it's now going in at varying different degrees within the organization and then pushing that data on.
I think that's absolutely it. It's everybody in the school needs to be aware of this. So everybody from your teaching staff to your office staff, your HR, business managers, catering staff, even the people, maybe particularly the people who are on the PCs, the computers that much, they really are going to need that training. Let's not think this is just something for IT people or for compliance people. Everybody in your organization, if they have any kind of access online as part of their work, is going going to need that. And I think it's also important to point out, Will, that while there's a lot that DPOs can do, it's not just all about your DPO and your data protection support. When it comes to that cyber support, you're going to have people in IT roles, there's going to be new products out there, and they're the people who are going to have the real knowledge and being able to support schools on what actually they can put in place on the tech and the systems front to reduce that type of illicit access into systems. I think while we recognise that as a very high risk, and I would expect it to be right up there on kind of any school's list of risks or their risk register, if you like. I think it's also important to go back to the start and point out that still most data breaches are more likely to be as a result of human error from within the organisation than they are as a result of as a cyber attack. And that's not me at all downplaying phishing cyber attacks. We know the carnage they can cause. We've seen it enough times, but don't sort of be taken away from the fact that it's still going to come down to just that human error element at the end of the day that is the one to try and get on top of.
Well, it's interesting that when you come up with those things, because it seems that what started off from my knowledge base of the DPO being fairly isolated, it actually links in very much well with the digital strategy of the school in terms of the IT teams, multiple people within the whole organization, the whole structure, and the ways that they look to move forward. Finally, what other bits of advice do you think you'll be able to give us in terms of obviously the sterling work that you guys do and supporting our schools?
I think first, it's the communication is the first thing. We need to be making sure we're communicating with our schools, but encourage our schools, please do continue communicating with us. That's how we're able to offer the best support and deliver the best value. We can't know just by default everything that's going on within that school on the data protection front. We do need to be told. I think the other thing to watch out for that I should have mentioned, Will, when we were talking about the landscape ahead, is Digital Information and Smart Data Bill, which is a new bill. It's a slightly sort of resuscitated version of the bill that we thought was going to go through previously. We will advise on those, we'll support on those as we begin to hear more and see how that legislation is going to take shape. What we do know is certain things like the sort of the reform restructure of the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. We think that's still going to take place. That in itself won't change what schools need to exactly be doing or looking out for, but that's just an example of something that we thought was going to be lost but has sort of revived. And the thing is, going back to what I said at the start, is we will make sure we keep schools abreast of that, and we will guide them through every step of the way of implementing whatever changes do need to be made.
Well, it's phenomenal, the length and breadth that you guys go through, and obviously having to keep abreast with new laws, new changes and what's going on. That's actually extremely insightful. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Cheers, Adam.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Cantium podcast in partnership with Public Sector Focus, please subscribe wherever you're listening or by visiting www.cantium.solutions.